Alright, so listen, we're going to be talking a lot about the game before we actually get in, just a word of warning for people, but I don't apologize for that. It's a long RPG, there's a ton of cool stuff to talk about here at the header. I want to lay some decent groundwork for you here all. We're all going to this on the same page. So welcome, this is my playthrough of Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age Edition. So if you're a newcomer to Final Fantasy, you should know, straight out the gate, it's an anthology series. Each game is its own separate story and separate world and separate universe and plot. This isn't the 12th chapter in some super long, obscure story that you won't be able to understand. It's perfectly fine if you know nothing about Final Fantasy to sit here, watch this video, play this game, and follow along. Final Fantasy XII is a standalone product for most concerns. Now, as an anthology series though, these games do all have recurring ideas like gameplay concepts, thematic concepts. They refer to each other in fun ways all the time. So the more you've played, you do get a bit of extra value. A few years back, you might have seen, I played on YouTube Final Fantasy X and its sequels, a show I really enjoyed putting on and has been well recommended and watched over the years. Maybe you saw those, but those games are totally disconnected. If you joined me on both adventures, well, you can be sure I'll be nodding back to some of those fun old times. So, Final Fantasy XII is extra special and a little more complicated than the normal Final Fantasy installments in that it's kind of a double anthology. So while usually full new releases means a new universe, the original directors for this game, Hiroyuki Ito and Yasumi Matsuno, for this actually decided to set 12 in an already established conceptual world called Evilis. Evilis had appeared in a previous Final Fantasy spin-off series, Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation 1, and then Tactics Advance for the Game Boy Advance. Tactics was kind of Matsuno's baby, and I guess he was keen when he got control of one of the main game releases to present Evilis to the main franchise. Again, you don't need to have played or know anything about Final Fantasy Tactics first to understand this game. In fact, I've never played any of the Tactics games, even though they're supposedly really good. The Evilis you explore in Tactics and Tactics Advance is basically unrecognizable geographically from Evilis in this game. How they link up in time and all that kind of stuff is largely speculative. It's just a collection of themes and ideas that are being carried over. Specifically, the games in the Evilis setting tend to have a much heavier political bent to them than the other Final Fantasies of the time. I think a lot of more recent Final Fantasies go very political too, to be honest. After FF12 released, there were a couple more games that got rolled into Evilis' setting, including a full sequel to this on the Nintendo DS called Revenant Wings. That whole collection is known as the Evilis Alliance now. So, for that reason, if you're a super geek, and maybe you watching this video are this, and you know everything about Final Fantasy and you've followed all of the Evilis Alliance, this game, and particularly when it first came out, was probably a real trip and something to behold. I'm not in that position, so I won't be obsessing about too much outside of the game itself. It's gonna be great, guys, even if you know absolutely nothing. I think another reason to be interested is because the MMO had a bunch of Evilis stuff added to that too as well, so maybe that's something to look out for. So, shifting gears here, on the original PlayStation 2, which is when I first played this game and was my first experience, when you booted the game up, they gave you this cool CGI montage that took a bunch of clips from later in the story and kind of mashed them together as a very first introduction to the game, and I was obsessed with this thing. I loved it because these are such big games, it can take ages to realize where all the clips on the montage actually come from and what they mean. But that was my first ever experience of FF12. Annoyingly, it doesn't exist on the new releases of the game. But happily, over on Square Enix's YouTube channel for the 10th year anniversary, they actually remastered the whole thing. So just like me, I think this is where you should start too. I have to prepare myself for nostalgia here. So I want to talk a little bit about this game's development, which is one of the more interesting sides of the product to me, and we'll be looking at a bit as we go along. 12 kind of had a strained development. It was originally conceived super early in the 2000s, 2001. This is right around when 10 had come out. So maybe you don't know this, but during the PlayStation 1 era of Final Fantasy, they got 3 games out on that console. They got 7, 8, and 9. Their plan was to have a lot of games for the PlayStation 2 also. They had 10, they had their concepts for 11 as an MMO, which had come from earlier, but both 12 and 13 were supposed to be on the PlayStation 2. That didn't happen in the end. 13 came out on the PS3, and it's because 12 had a ton of delays and took way longer to get out the door than they expected. It's funny that happened because this title was sort of conceived as a safer choice for the studio. They executed this same idea with Final Fantasy IX during the PlayStation 1 days. It was supposed to feel a lot more like the classic Final Fantasies from the Nintendo era, not taking too many risks and yet selling well, which it does feel like those games. But it did take a ton of risks when it came to the actual gameplay, radically stepping away from the turn-based or active time battle systems we had seen earlier in the series. In a kind of funny twist of fate, 12 did end up a lot like 9 for one big reason. 9 came out right towards the end of the PlayStation 1's life cycle, and its sales got impacted quite badly from that. 12 got delayed so much that the studio was scared the same thing was going to happen to it, which accelerated its release, and they pushed it out the door, probably not in as finished of a state as they would have wanted. A kind of weird little fact that's funny to me to look back on, this game actually had a Guinness World Record at one point for the supposedly longest development period in a video game production of 5 years. Which is really funny for me to see now. I can count many games that took longer than 5 years to make or eventually released. Just shows how the times have changed, but you gotta remember, around this era, or a few years prior, Square had been really pushing out a lot of Final Fantasies very fast. There was a lot of churn. So this is the big topic. To what extent is Final Fantasy XII a half-baked game? I've read a lot of articles about this online, and I don't think people go into as much detail as they really could be. First, it's definitely true that some stuff got cut. That's invariably going to be true for most products. In particular, really early on with this game, they wanted a 2-player mode, and something that looks a lot like the Final Fantasy X-2 monster capture system, but it goes deeper than that. See, during development, one of the original directors, Matsuno, whose baby this was, stepped down and left the project completely, which was kind of a big deal for Square of this era. So the official statement back then, and even corroborated in more recent interviews, though not that recent really, is that it was due to health concerns, but they've never elaborated on that in any substantive way, and other sources tell a different story, that this was a matter of incompatible ideas and difficult to work with people. In fact, if you dig on the Wayback Machine to articles around the internet 2005, for example here, oneup.com says that when part of the Final Fantasy XII team was said to have left Square Enix for a new development studio called Mistwalker, Matsuno was reported to have not shown up to work for a month until the crisis was resolved. And they say after his departure that we're not sure what he's working on now, and whether he was kicked off the team or if he voluntarily removed himself, although he is still said to be at Square. We of course know now, after this article was published, he did in fact leave Square. So this is kind of cool to think about. Interestingly, the creator of the first Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, he wasn't involved in the project at all, but he was reportedly so disappointed by Matsuno's departure that he declined to play this game beyond even its introduction. Matsuno does talk about this. He has reaffirmed over the years that he was sad to let people down, but not much more. I think of this a lot like the whole Snyder/Whedon cut of the Justice League movie. Just what would Matsuno's original vision, given free reign, have ended up looking like? I want to be clear that the idea FF12 isn't as good as it could be isn't just speculation based on dev stories before it came out. The game was reviewed extremely highly when it came out, but people did take note of various things, particularly the story, which is a big part of these games, has had a lot of attention. The developers, after release, admitted they changed who the main character was meant to be during production, and I'll explain more in the videos as we actually meet those characters. And the game's executive producer basically admitted he thought the storyline didn't meet fan expectations. They confirmed someone called Miwa Shoda wrote the story based on the premise of cutscenes and world building that was already done long before she got there. But maybe that's not too unheard of in the industry. So, is it an unfinished game? Recently, I've seen people push back against this idea a lot. I don't know whether that's just a result of an entrenched fan base that loses objectivity over time, but I kind of agree that the director swap doesn't necessarily have to mean that much. But, to me, it is absolutely evident when the studio ran out of road and were told they had to get this thing out. And I'm excited to show you guys that as we go through our playthrough here. Now, I don't want to put you off. This is still a really good game that did a lot of things incredibly well, generated huge buzz and hype back in the day. These are just fun things to think about. In fact, speaking of hype, let's break up my long monologue here with a trailer from the game I think most people haven't seen that featured none other than Patrick Stewart.
A world on the brink of war. A journey to the edge of Armageddon. Final Fantasy takes you to the limit of your imagination. Challenge an empire. Liberate a nation. Change the world. Final Fantasy XII, only on PlayStation 2.
Yeah, it was short, I know, but hey, it was an ad for TV, so it couldn't be that long. They played that apparently over here in the UK, but it's funny, I don't remember ever seeing that on TV, even though I was really enthusiastic about all this subject material right around this time in my life when I was kind of a mid-young teenager. So next, I want to talk about the Zodiac Age, and what it is exactly we're playing, because you didn't just have the Final Fantasy XII release, it has warped and changed over the years, and for Final Fantasy XII, it's actually quite important, so we'll do this at the header. We're playing the Zodiac Age, which is the most recent re-release of the game and is ostensibly the most feature-complete edition. It's actually pretty new, you can see the date down there at the bottom of the screen. But it has its pros and cons. Let's rewind the clock. The original release was in 2006, both Japan and the West. One was early in the year, one was later in the year. That's when young me first got my hand on it and was the main version of the game I played for years and years and years. Weird trivia, usually when the game comes to the West, things get censored, like nudity and stuff. There are a few tweaks, so you kind of get less of the game when you play it in the West. For this, the Western version was actually the more complete one, because there's a cutscene, and this is not a spoiler, don't worry, but where a woman is tied up. And horribly, right as 12 released in Japan, there'd been this big story in the news about a guy kidnapping these girls, so Japanese players never got to see that scene. They removed it, feeling it was distasteful. No such problems over here. As I alluded to a second ago, there were things criticized about 12, and particularly because the gameplay was so radically different from all the other Final Fantasies, a lot of people struggled with it, and this probably made the studio insecure about the original, in my opinion, proper combat balance. Some other things kind of messed with their release numbers. They were competing with Kingdom Hearts 2, funnily enough, which I think shifted the date a bit. A year later, in Japan only, so we're in 2007, there was a re-release called the International Zodiac Job System, or IZJS, as you'll see it referred to on the internet all the time. If you watched my playthrough of 10 and 10.2, you'll remember I talked about a similar thing happening here. Basically, the game comes back to Japan, and people in Japan get to play it with like the English voice acting and stuff, and there are new features. Now, the IZJS was an absolutely massive overhaul. It shifted loot and items around, it added a whole new class system, and so much more stuff. But you could only get it in Japan. This edition of the game was not perfect. Remember that combat insecurity I talked about? Well, yeah, they made the game a lot easier at this point and flat out threw away a ton of the game balance by allowing players to do more damage and getting rid of the damage cap, which actually had big balance consequences we'll get to down the line. They also made some straight up just weird and unnecessary changes simply to differentiate the two editions, even if they made no sense. Finally, They added a super speed mode that allows you to just play the whole thing in turbo. A lot of players really like it, a lot of players really don't. I'll give you my opinions on that later. And there, pretty much the story stops. Those were the two versions of the game for many years. I was always very excited about playing the International Zodiac job system, and as it so happened, so were a few other nerds in the Anglosphere on the internet too. See, for many years you could play it in the West. You had to get a community patch that would combine both versions of the game, the mechanics of the Zodiac job system with the language and text of the US and Europe releases. If you had a chipped PS2 or could emulate it on a beefy enough PC in those days, well, you could play the game. And there's a whole era of my life where I was obsessed with this. I did do a patched playthrough of the XII, spent God knows how many hours troubleshooting and getting it to work and playing it, and all of it seems really pointless now. Why? Well, because it's all here. 10 years later, for the PlayStation 4, they released the Zodiac Age. The Zodiac Age is another re-release with upscaled HD graphics for current generation consoles and hardware. If you're clued in at all with Final Fantasy and Square Enix, you'll know they've been re-releasing a ton of their PlayStation 2 library stuff recently. Well, this was one of them. Funnily, this came right at the arse end of most of it. The HD edition of Final Fantasy X, which is what I was playing on YouTube a few years ago, really predates this one. In fact, for a little while there, people thought that the studio hated 12 and it was never going to happen until at last the day came when we got a trailer. So this HD remaster is based on IZJS. That means, yeah, you get the new class system and features and weapons, and for most people in the West, this is going to feel substantively different. They also added some new tweaks on top. A lot of them pretty good, like we're on PS4, so there's new trophies now, and there are changes to the bestiary and character portraits. There's a new re-recorded soundtrack of the whole thing, including some new songs that weren't there before. There's a new map overlay system, and they added some other tweaks which again messed with the game's balance, making it way easier. You can have double classes now, not just one, two. They doubled the turbo mode up to 4 times now, made the game autosave everywhere, so there's no sense of tension in dungeons or risk-reward, and you guessed it, more direct buffs to player tools and combat balance. So when this edition came out, I was keen to play it for you all on YouTube right then and there, but funnily enough, at the same time they put 10 on PC. They ported their HD remaster to PC, and being on PC meant higher frame rate and more resolution and stuff. And I figured, hey, they'll probably do that for 12 as well, which ended up true. A year after the Zodiac Age came out, they put it on Steam. This is what I'm playing. I'm not on my PlayStation 4 right now. It's easier for me to record on Steam, and this version had some more tweaks, including even more music options, and they straight up added cheats to the main menu. I'm not joking, you can press a button and max out your money and all kinds of stuff. It's very weird. One final bit to the story is that last year they put it on Switch and Xbox One, which both got their own new features. Remember how you can now have double classes? Well, now you can swap those classes anytime you like, and they added a build loadout feature. Both of those are pretty cool, right? And makes it look like you have to play on Switch or Xbox to have the definitive edition. Well, guess what happened just a few weeks ago? There was a patch on Steam, which brought the Switch and Xbox stuff to PC. All of this is to say, I'm playing the Zodiac Age on Steam, and this is the definitive edition of the game. It has everything from every edition ever. Okay, so one final topic, I swear, and then we're into it. And that topic is modding. As I just expressed, the game came out on PC a couple of years ago, and that's really helped the modding community. There's been one since before its PC release, but I feel like the swap has somewhat accelerated things. That small community is filled with talent, and they've made some amazing stuff possible now. Maybe you got this impression as I described the version changes a second ago, but in all honesty, I rate this Zodiac Age re-release with all its new features actually very poorly in terms of combat design. It's a ridiculously easy game, where most bosses and combat sequences actually are just kind of boring, because nothing interesting ever gets a chance to happen. You just mow everything down. If you decide to do side quests, which I absolutely will be through this video series, you're going to be so overpowered. You're like 2 or 3-shotting most bosses. They would be dead in seconds, and that completely invalidates all the cool story moments and my memories of how great this game was in the PlayStation 2. But I still want all the features. So the answer for me has been modding. I'm reluctant to use mods at all, because what I really want to do is archive and show off the game as Square Enix designed it and give you a video series that is as true to the real thing as is possible. But the vanilla Zodiac age is just so far away from what was once there in the PlayStation 2, I had to get hands-on and change things. In many cases, this actually brings Square's own stuff out better. Let's take a look at that remastered boot up cutscene again. What do you notice about this? Well, it's at a letterboxed aspect ratio. There's massive black bars at the top and bottom of the screen. Those are actually always there in Final Fantasy XII, on the PlayStation 2 editions right up through to the newest ones. All the CGI cutscenes have these black bars. And so you might think, well, obviously that's all they rendered, right? Actually, no. Late in the game's development, they just slapped these bars on there over the top of fully realized, beautifully rendered CGI that no one's ever been able to see. So one of the things you can do with mods, I actually made this tweak manually in the end, is to remove the black bars. You guys on this video series are going to see a lot more detail on CGI cutscenes, more than you probably ever have before, or most players ever have before. I've done lots with mods like this. I want to be clear though, I haven't changed anything radical. Things are specifically set up so this will look almost entirely vanilla. There are no story differences or new dialogue or anything like that. Hell, I actually only have 3 or 4 mods installed, but they do have sweeping changes. In particular, the most important mod is called The Struggle for Freedom, which was made by a guy called Eternal248. What this does is bumps the stats of all the enemies and their health and things back up to a level where the game feels like it did on the PlayStation 2, and then goes even further and tweaks different abilities and items and things to make the game play better. It's a fantastic mod that I can't recommend enough, especially if you're going to be playing alongside with me. The one thing for me personally making these YouTube videos about SFF, Struggle for Freedom, is that it also did weird things like swap one type of weapon for another type of weapon, and it's looking to add whole new categories of magic and stuff, which doesn't feel vanilla and obviously isn't what Square Enix was doing. So that's where I've come in with my own mods that gives me the best of both worlds and various other changes that I enjoy, which keep the game kind of immersive and just improve on what Square was doing rather than replace what Square was doing. I'm going to structure this YouTube playlist so that at the end, the last videos available, will be more specific discussion about my modding setup, but I know not everyone will be interested, at least yet, so we'll leave that to the side for now. That is the game as I'll be playing it. Modded the Zodiac Age on Steam, but with the best of both worlds, PlayStation 2 up to the newest era. That's about 20 minutes. Let's get stuck in. So the main menu, not much really to talk about here. We'll be clicking new game, obviously, load game to jump back in where you were before. With the new auto saves, you're pretty much always going to be exactly where you last left off. And then there's trial mode. So this got added with IZJS. It's sort of like it's not the main game at all. It's like a parallel experience where you fight through 100 stages with all kinds of enemies and interesting stuff going on. We'll look at that maybe way later. But for now, new game. They play us a long, slow animation. So then we come to this menu. Now there's quite a lot going on here. First, you've got New Game Plus and Minus. In New Game Plus, you're all like really high level. And in the latest re-releases, I think you take your items through, as you'd expect from a New Game Plus feature. This one's pretty cool. New Game Minus is basically weak mode. I've done a playthrough of this before, where your characters will not level up, which sounds really bad for any kind of big JRPG. But in this game, so many of your stats come from equipment. It's actually doable. It's really interesting. In the first edition, there was an item that meant you get 0 XP, and then they kind of supported it with a full mode. You also used to only unlock these if you beat like trial mode and you went and did loads of stuff. Nowadays, they're just always there immediately for you, which is quite nice. Graphics settings, I've got everything maxed out, as maxed as it will possibly be. We don't have to worry. Controls, you can customize if you like. I'm actually playing with a DualShock 4 controller connected to the PC, but I am on PC. Speaking of the controller, by the way, vibration, you have to do something special to make vibrating work. I don't know why. I think it's because the game uses direct input and it's not in direct input, so you have to do something else. Can't remember. Screen shake will turn on. Subtitles I will turn on. Just because, to be honest, a lot of the voice acting sounds that the quality of the audio equipment and compression settings is kind of naff in this game. I'll whine a lot about that as we go along. But subtitles so you guys can see on screen what's happening if you can't understand their accents and stuff, which does happen a lot. Invert camera. Okay, so the speed mode multiplier, you can mess with these in-game. You can mess with all of this in-game, so don't worry about this much. I'm going to leave it on 2. We probably won't use this much. In fact, I'm really going to try to not use it much at all. Change the language from Japanese to English. The 3 soundtrack options. Original, reorchestrated, and then the PC edition added OST, which is official soundtrack, so you can get the soundtrack version of it, which I guess maybe is an even higher quality. I'm going to stick with reorchestrated for now. And then volume sliders. I actually recommend taking music down a little bit in this game, just a little bit. And that's it. So we'll hit new game. And we're through! Ready to enjoy the first cutscene, which will be beautifully rendered CGI as Final Fantasy was so famous for at the time. Our first look at a new world. And no black bars. Ah, lovely. The Kingdom of Dalmasca, and we are looking at the royal city of Rabanastre.
In the name of the Father, and in the presence of these holy relics, I hereby pronounce you man and wife from this time forth. May the blessings of the gods light your path for all eternity. Far on.
Launch an attack by both land and air, our kingdom will stand little...
Nabudis has fallen.
Impossible!
My father? I know not. I am sorry.
If Nabudis has indeed fallen, it is only a matter of time before they reach the borders of Dalmasca. There is nothing to halt their advance.
Secure Nalbina with all haste.
I will go.
And I will go at his side.
So you can see we're still well entrenched in the sort of magic sci-fi mix of this era of Final Fantasy games.
Galtea, stand watch over your life.
That I be considered worthy.
Man, I can never get over the sight of armored chocobo combat. I love it so much.
The fortress is lost! We must withdraw!
No! The paling still stands!
Shield beyond sight. Near failing light.
The paling's fallen!
Then it's over!
For my father. For my father!
Lord Rasler!
Blessings of the Great Father descend, and guide your bodies return to the earth. Great Father, guide your spirits return to the Mother of all. There you shall find peace. Pharaoh.
God, I love that shot of the crows, and anywhere there's the airships overhead at the ground. Such a strong memory for me. So I'm going to pause on this screen with the book real quick. The game's kind of split into 3 big acts, and at each one, this book appears, and we hear basically a massive exposition dump giving us politics and happenings around the world, as written by one of the characters in the game, a guy called Ondor. The thing is, I actually think this first scene is really awful. You need to know that Final Fantasy XII, when it does its exposition dumps, moves really fast, and I don't want you guys missing out. So I'm going to put this into my own words here, just so that we're on the same page. This is the conceptual world of Evilis as far as Final Fantasy XII is concerned. It's a place with all these different nations. You can see the big blue one, Rosaria, is a superpower to the southwest, and there's another one called Arcadia to the northeast. You'll notice that in the middle there's these small nations where like these big 3 land masses connect. That's called the Galtean Peninsula, and really the story is about that area of the world, these small nations that are being jostled about by these massive superpowers that are expanding. You can look at the game almost as alluding to, say, the United States of America and the USSR during the Cold War, leaving World War II. Remember, this game actually comes from Japan, which kind of is a small nation caught between these superpowers, particularly through the Cold War and the development of nukes and how that affected Japan in the real world. You're going to see is a massive thing in this game, especially that whole nuke thing, which we'll come back to shortly. I don't know if the studio ever openly acknowledged they were specifically looking at real-world stuff, by the way. You can actually draw lots of real-world political events close to this, but I'm not too interested in those discussions. So, in the opening cutscene just now, we saw a prince from that small nation of Nebradia in the middle marry a princess from the small nation of Dalmasca in an attempt to basically unite against these massive superpowers on their doorsteps. And it was a very romantic, Disney-esque wedding, blah, blah, blah. So another thing happened too. Now, this wasn't really in the cutscene, but it's important to know, and the place you get it is a stupid, obscure place I'll talk to you about in a few videos or so. Don't worry, this isn't spoilery at all. Right before that cutscene, Do you see how the Nebradians are next to the red, the Arcadians? They're most concerned of being swallowed up by Arcadia. They don't really have so many problems with the blues because the blues are quite far away. You know, there's a buffer state between the two. So what the Nebradians did was invite the Rosarians into their land as protection, if you will. But in doing that, in allowing the blues so close to red territory, they spurred the red guys into action and they attacked. That's what you saw in the cutscene. There was this nice wedding, but then immediately one of the nations was attacked. So both the Dalmascans and the Nebradians went to defend, but the prince was killed and the battle was lost. So Nebradia is wiped off the map and only Dalmasca remains. So now I'll hand you back over to Ondor, who will explain the fallout of that, and he uses very kind of archaic, like convoluted language. Just feel free to pause the video and do a quick little Google define if you want to. It'll help, trust me.
The death of Lord Rasla Heos Nebradia was but one of many tragedies to befall the Kingdom of Dalmasca. The air of hope that had surrounded Her Royal Highness Princess Asha's wedding was now quite lost. Dalmasca had been set adrift at the mercy of history's restless tides. At this time, two great empires struggled for dominion over Ivalice: Arcadia in the east, Rosaria the west. The invasion of the Kingdom of Nebradia was Arcadia's first step in its westward march. With Lord Rasla's beloved homeland consumed by the hellfires of war, it seemed clear that Arcadia would soon mete out a like fate to Dalmasca. The fall of the fortress at Nalbina told the destruction of the greater part of Dalmasca's forces. A counterattack was mounted by the order of the Knights of Dalmasca, ever brave and faithful. But against the martial might of the Arcadian armies, they stood little chance of victory. Indeed, their defeat was to be absolute. Soon thereafter, Arcadia came forward, offering terms of peace, or, as one might rather put it, terms of Dalmasca's surrender. Lord Ramenas, King of Dalmasca, and my dear friend, had no choice but to accept these terms. It was, thus, only with reluctance that he set out for Nalbina Fortress, now under Arcadian occupation, to affix his seal to the Emperor's Treaty of Peace. The king had scarce departed his royal city of Rabanasta when the remnants of the Order made their return, and not a moment too soon, for a terrible revelation awaited them. The treaty would be signed with steel and writ in royal blood.
So this is from the memoirs of Marquis Halim Ondor IV, and that was chapter 12 on the fall of kingdoms. He's a man we'll get to know later. So yeah, the game is going to begin at this place called the Nalbina Fortress, which the Arcadians now occupy. And the king of Dalmasca, the man whose daughter was getting married a moment ago, he's gone there to surrender to the Arcadians, who have just won Nebradia for themselves and wiped out most of Dalmasca's own forces. Now word is that the king is in trouble during the treaty signing.
You there? Can you hear me?
It's as I feared. They're slowing us down.
Do not say that. Not all of us are here for love of battle. He fights to defend his homeland. Your name?
Rex, sir. My name's Rex.
Good. Rex. You bore a few cuts, but you are still whole. Well, can you stand?
Think you can fight?
I'm fine, sir.
How old are you, Rex?
17, sir.
Young. Family?
My brother is all I have left, sir. He's 2 years younger than I, living in Rabanastre.
So young. You're barely old enough to be a man. You shouldn't be forced to wield a sword.
No, sir. I want to fight. For my homeland. And for my parents.
It's time, Bosch.
Save the discussion for later. We must reach the king before they act, or all our efforts will be in vain.
I'm aware of the situation.
We found them! Over there!
Bossler, go ahead. I will handle this rabble.
Godspeed.
So this guy's badass.
Steady, Rex. Keep your wits about you and you'll make it. We move!
So, in Final Fantasy XII, we play as this guy, Rex, a fighter for Dalmasca. Over there is Bosch. Now, do you remember a moment ago I said during the game's development they had a different idea for a main character? Well, it was actually Bosch. It was going to be like this older man in his prime, and they liked that idea. But I guess this kind of JRPG don't sell so well unless the main character is somewhat younger, and they basically ended up moving away from that. A lot of people think that the main character was actually going to be someone else, but no, it's Bosch. It was that guy over there, who is here still at the start of the game nonetheless. So anyway, we must always be mindful of our surroundings. Look around with the right stick. It's a useful way to spot Imperials. The port is actually pretty good. If you use a mouse and keyboard, it will dynamically update all the icons and stuff on screen. But I have to play with a PlayStation controller. Of course I do. That's where all my memories and nostalgia is from. It's ridiculous. So, yeah, we're just going to look around and admire the view as we swing a little bit here. There you go. And then they'll teach us that the left stick allows us to move. He says, you can walk. Yes, come stand before me. So there's a bit of a mix in this game of spoken dialogue and then just written stuff that you read on screen. Obviously, I'll read the stuff out when it is to be read out. As far as the spoken dialogue is concerned, you guys might have already heard it, and I'm just going to get this out of the way with, there's something wonky and weird about the English voices, like the actual quality of the tracks. They sound really muddy and hazy. It super annoys me. I can't really do anything about it. What's weird is if you look at some of the early trailers for the game, you'll hear that they have clean versions of all that audio, but it was never released to the public. So yeah, sorry if you guys hear that. Maybe I should never have mentioned it in the commentary and brought your attention to the fact, but it's what I'm thinking about half the time while watching the cutscene, so I'm gonna make you guys think about it as well. So yeah, we can just run around, as you can see here, and we approach Bosch himself. And we've learned that. Do you see the mark above my head? He says that's a talk icon. You can talk to any character showing these. Talk to someone, approach them, and press X. So they really will give us the basics. So our job is to talk to him, but we can run over to Bosch himself. And he says, do you see the marker above my head? And we can figure it out. So we'll run over to this guy now, approach the Dalmascan by the gate. And we got this guy. He says, life is worth too much to throw away, Rex. Do what you can, but don't try to be a hero. Save the hero stories for your brother once we're back in Rabanasta. Just listen to the captain and we will get through this. So we'll enter the fortress through this gate. We must go. Man, I'm really curious about some of you guys who know this game and this story and watch through all of this, because there's so many double meanings to things that I really want to talk about, but we'll hold off to later. So another cool little thing about the controls that they won't teach us here, but is if I actually use the D-pad, I can specifically target different people. And while targeting someone, if I hold the left trigger, I can actually hone in on them. This is kind of useful in fights, and it's just sort of a fun way to examine and look at stuff. A lot of players don't use this feature. I'll be using it as much as possible. In the bottom right, you see it says the tutorial to go to the Iron Gate. Can we speak to him again? This is the Captain Bosch, Rex. We're heading in through the gate. And he says, we'll enter the fortress through the gate. We must go. All right, so we can interact with objects as well. See the icon above your head? That's called an action icon, where the exclamation mark, basically. One of these will appear when you approach a door, like a switch or an item. To learn more about what you found, just walk closer and press X. You never get punished for pressing X or anything like that. Here you can see this is an iron gate, and we can swing it open like so. It's time. We'll drive back any Imperials standing between us and the king. Dalmasca's future hangs in the balance. Stay focused on the foes before you, Rex. I will watch rearward. They use so many beautiful and weird, archaic, almost arcane language in this game. It's a real treat. And again, if you guys don't get it, just do a quick Google to find. Just pause the video. You will get a lot more out of the game from that. Also, by the way, if you press triangle, you can pull up a log and reread anything people say. My instinct in Final Fantasy games is to just reinitiate a conversation with the character and go through it all again. But in this game, you could do the log thing, and hopefully I'll do that on occasion. I just like showing off all the different features, so there you go. So he says, I'll watch rearward, and we move on up. During the loading screen there, we auto-save. There's a little marker for that every time. So he says you can open the party menu by pressing triangle, and then you can examine your equipment and inventory. This is kind of terribly done, because if we press triangle now, we just go to the log, and you actually won't get a chance to do that tip. It immediately transitions us into the first fight. So that's fun. So here we are. That red line is a hostile target line. Take heed, you're being targeted. When a foe targets you, the line's red, and when you target a foe, it's blue. So when you see a red line, you know you're about to be attacked. If they're not readily apparent, use the right stick to look around, and when you found them, open the battle menu and attack, blah, blah, blah. I'll explain this to you guys yourself, so you can do it, Rex. This is the combat system, and it's a really weird, different combat system. In all the main series Final Fantasies before this, you'd run around and then you get like a random encounter, and then you would have a turn-based or a slightly more active twist on a turn-based experience. In this game, it's all in the overworld. And that meant that the format for the game was completely different. Like, the way that areas are structured and skills work and everything is crazy different. And you've actually seen that when 13 came out, they kind of went back. They went back to the old idea. And then 14 was another MO. 15, they've started going back to the action stuff again these days. So this was a weird time for this franchise. So, here's the guy. You saw the red line. Now, if I at any point press X, everything's going to pause because we're on wait mode. We'll talk more about that later. And I get my classic Final Fantasy attack options on the bottom left. Okay, so it's still a strategic game in that sense. I can choose to attack, and then I can pick my target. And you see there that I'm choosing this guy. If I press L1 or R1, I can actually swap. So I can choose to attack my friends here. And again, you can hold to actually zoom in on them. So maybe we don't like Barsh and we attack him. Not a good idea. Barsh, by the way, has question mark health and his question mark level. He's a badass. You'll also see that his name's, this is at the top left, his name's written in red. That means he's a way higher level than us, and we probably shouldn't attack him. And then these guys' levels are more like ours, and we can see they're level 3. We're level 3 as well, by the way. You start the game at level 3 on this one. So, yeah, we can do that, or we can choose magics. White magics are like healy things. Black magics, if you're familiar with other Final Fantasies, are kind of elemental damagey things and other options. Here we can cast fire, or we can do thunder. And they're slightly tweaked because of one of the mods we're running. But I'm just going to attack him, okay? So I just hit attack, and then you'll see here, on the bottom right, and I can't really pause, but here on the bottom right, you'll see it's got attack written there, and it's flashing next to Rex's name, and there's a yellow bar. That yellow bar is my charge bar. So every attack takes a while to charge up and actually execute. Now, Rex is a pretty fast attacker here, so if you just watch that bar as we swing away here, you'll see we attack, and then it charges, and then we attack, and then it charges. And we're just going to keep looping through that, because that's what we told him to do. And there you go, that's the attacks. And he dies, we get some experience, and we can move on. You don't need an enemy to do that stuff. At any time, I can just press X, and there it is. We can choose to fight anyone we want. You know, we can swing at this dude. I wonder what... I've never actually done this. Should we swing at him? He managed to block us. Good job. That's kind of funny. And you saw that we got the blue target line. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to swap to the config menu, and I'm going to change the battle mode to active. Now, what this means is that while we have this menu up, nobody pauses anymore. Everything keeps moving. And for the majority of the game, I will be playing on active, but sometimes when we want to be more strategic, we'll swap. Another really important thing here is battle speed. So if we set this really high to fast, all the enemies will swing really fast and charge spells and stuff fast, and so will we. Everything like goes rapid fire. And if we set it to slow, it all slows down. Now, in theory, this shouldn't affect anything, really, because they speed up, we speed up, right? So the balance is the same. The thing is, the devs implemented this really shoddily, which means, say I give myself a buff that lasts like 60 seconds, that doesn't change. So really, you want to be on fast. If you want to make the game as easy as possible, set it on fast, because that means all your buffs, you get to execute the highest number of actions during that buff timer because you're just moving faster here. So, or you can move it to slow. If you're trying to run away from enemies, this doesn't affect how fast you move, right? So if you set it to slow, then all the enemies can only attack you every now and then, but you get to run past them, if that makes sense. So a lot of people mess with this. I think that's really gamey. I'm going to leave it exactly on default the whole time. If you guys play along with me, you can mess with this to make the game easier for yourself. I don't recommend it. If you watch like really hardcore Final Fantasy 12 players, they're constantly in the menus messing with the stuff. I think that stuff's all lame. I'm also going to get rid of the target lines. I know we just learned about that, but I'm going to get rid of those. And then finally, there's this new option here, cursor position. I'm going to have that on last selection. That just means if I choose to cast fire, well, let's cast fire on this guy. He can't block magic, so... Well, you can sort of evade magic as a stat later. Okay, so we almost killed him and he potioned. But now, you'll see when I press X, it's already selected fire, so it's nice and easy for us. That's the memory option. So there you go, let's move on. That's it, really. That's the whole combat system. They give you one little guy to fight to learn it, and he gets swarmed by all your allies. And now we're going to be in a boss fight. I'm not joking. There's a boss right here, so we're going to use everything we've learned to take him out.
Captain?
Alright, so actually, let's go to wait here, because I'm going to have stuff to talk about during the boss fight. Right, so, bosses, nice big health bar at the top. By the way, our health is on the bottom right. It's above our head, obviously. That bar above our head, that's our health. You can also see our MP. MP is used to cast spells. So if you look at my black magic here on the bottom left, you see it says MP 6. That means you can only cast so many spells before you start having to swing with your weapon again. Rex is going to be able to get quite a few casts in here, though, because we do have 40 MP, and these spells only cost 6 at the start of the game, so that's nice. So if we target the boss, you can see information about him. Up in the top left, you'll see he's level 10. We're only level 3. Luckily, we've got a lot of allies. This boss is weak to both fire and lightning, so it doesn't matter what black magic we spell. We'll do a lot of damage. And so the trick to beating this boss really easily is not to attack like this, okay? And in fact, if you're close to him, he has a special move that can really hurt. Don't attack him. In fact, just stand back and cast spells. So I'm going to cast Thunder, which has an instant activation. So you see here, we can cast Thunder and do a good amount of damage. We did 200 there. You notice our friends are doing like 9, 8, 7. Barsh hits like a ton. If you notice, Barsh is actually comboing there. That's why that says 3 hits. And he was doing like 100 each hit. So Barsh is amazing. But we can actually contribute quite well if we are using spells. So that's the trick to this fight. Most bosses, as I go through this playthrough with the way that I've got it modded and set up, bosses are really dangerous and really scary, but they all have like an Achilles heel, an easy way to take them out. And for this guy, it is this, just casting spells. So there we actually managed to get a debuff on him as well called Oil, which is going to increase our fire damage even more. And there you also saw Air Cutter Remora. Air Cutter Remora uses Remora's Strike. And that's almost killed our friends. So we can potion them if we want. You know, they have actually potioned themselves already. But I can target, say, Barsh with the potion over there. And I can throw it at him and keep him healed up. You see, my soldier allies will die. We've already lost 2 of them. There's only 1 guy left now, which is kind of bad. We need them for the next screen. So really, the best way to do this is just keep spamming Thunder. So let's do this. You got to kind of be in range, and while you're casting spells, you're animation locked, so you can't like run around while casting. Another thing is, after the spell is done, you'll see Rex automatically goes back to wanting to attack. Right now, he wants to attack, but he's not in range, so he's just standing there. I'd have to run over. But I kind of don't want to run over unless it's a very precise moment, because this Remora Strike move is very scary. So again, we still got lots of MP left. The boss is getting pretty low. I really don't want my friend to die, so I'm going to potion him again. Now, potions don't have cast times. In fact, sorry, items in general don't have cast times. Attacking, you've got to charge up. Spells, you've got to charge up. This thing is instant, so it's always a good idea to use potions. They're a big part of the game. In other Final Fantasies, you can kind of ignore items, but not in this one. It's really useful to actually go for them. Let's finish him off with fire here, because he has oil on him, so we'll do... Oh, no, I don't want to fire you. I want to fire you. Yeah, that's fine. We're just waiting. So, potions have no cast time, but they have a long, like, after cast. It takes you a while before you can do the next move. But there you go. Look at that. 800 damage with fire. And the boss fight's over. Pretty good. We did lose suffer some casualties there, though, so I'm a bit worried about that. So, here's Barsh. He's going to finish him off. with this special ability. Later in the game, we'll actually learn how to use abilities like this, but for now...
Antlion, this is Sunbury. My engines are hit. She'll not hold much longer.
We receive you, Tonberry. You've leave to retire. Well fought.
My thanks, Antlion. Tonberry disengaging.
So there we go, that's the boss fight done. And we can move on. By the way, a little bit of trivia there. That's an Arcadian airship, and it was called the air cutter Remora. Most of the airships in this game are named after summons from the other Final Fantasies. So Remora was a summon, I think, in like 5 or 6 or something. He also said he was Tonberry, and he spoke to Antlion. Those are enemies from other Final Fantasies. There aren't any proper Tonberries in this game, which is a shame, because that's one of my favorite kind of recurring enemy from the franchise. But at least the Tonberry gets a little reference there. But yeah, this guy's the Remora. It's really easy to tell that the other big airships are named after summons, but that one's pretty obscure. It's right there. So we are actually about to get attacked by 3 Imperials coming down that staircase there, as you can see. But I will deal with that in the next part, I think. So each episode in this playlist, I'm thinking, will be somewhere in the area of half an hour to an hour long. I don't know. It all depends. You guys can leave comments if you'd like. But yeah, I'll be back for more very soon, and we will continue. We will go save the king and be the heroes of this story. So thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. So far, we're only just scratching the surface. If you are getting to the series late, I want to remind people I always check my YouTube comments. I don't care how late you get into this video. I love comments, and I will be very likely to respond to you. And also, don't forget to check out the playlist view in the description. That'll autoplay the whole series in order. Thanks, everybody. See you for the next one.